Welcome everyone to another edition of Drunk Agile. We've had a little bit of a setback here at Drunk Agile because we're right now we're in contract negotiations with Nisha, and
Yeah, yeah.
she's decided to walk off the set. She
Yeah, we've had some. I was explaining to them we've had some diva issues. It's been raining non-stop for the past 3 days in South Florida, and in the last 45 minutes, Nisha's decided that she needs to go for a walk twice in the rain. And when we came back in, she also decided that she is not coming upstairs for the show. She just decided, no, that's not a thing that's happening today. So yeah, we have a, how do I say this? We have a substitute.
I don't know if we
Um,
want to say that. I don't. It's an S word, but I don't know if it's substitute. I'm not I'm
and
not
there we are.
I'm not really sure what that is.
So Spartacus is substituting for Nisha today.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, hopefully by the next time we record, we would have had these contract disputes resolved.
Yeah, something about, we didn't take all the brown M&Ms out of her
Yeah,
bowl
something like
or
that.
something. Whatever. I was like, okay, initially, hey, but she's the star of the show, so she gets to name her price. So
Yeah.
hopefully we'll have that fixed by the next episode. Prateek, what are you drinking? First to give us.
Yeah. Last time we were in London, I picked up this rum cask matured, Fetakaran, 15-year-old, 53.3. I'm really enjoying this. It's actually really nice. It's got a much lighter color than what I saw you pour earlier, Dan. I'm giving some of that, but yeah, I'm actually really enjoying this.
Yeah, I'm back to the Garrison Brothers bourbon.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah, that's what and yes, as you can see, I'm not sure there was any sherry left in the barrel after they, but interestingly enough, what's funny, you've had this, it
Yeah,
doesn't taste sherried, which is really kind of weird.
yeah, which is surprising. It's complex, but it's not sure. Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, so it's good.
Well,
Anyway, cheers everyone.
just
Thanks for watching. Prateek, why don't you tell us what we're talking about tonight?
yeah. So we've gotten this question a couple of times, and last time it was asked, it was by one of the program trainers, Troy Lightfoot, asked about this. I was talking about control charts and process behavior charts, and we're probably going to do a couple of videos on this, but just kind of a deeper dive into those. So maybe this video we talk a little more about the control charts and where it came from, what it is, and how you might be seeing it around, and it might not really be a control chart that you're looking at. So Dan, what's a control chart?
Yeah. So I'm going to ramble a bit here because we have to get into some history about this stuff. Hopefully Prateek will be able to interrupt from time to time and interject some things, but you might want to get comfortable if you don't have a whiskey of your own. Definitely get a whiskey because it's time for a fireside chat with Dan. So we have to go way back in time, to the 1920s, with a guy by the name of Walter Shewhart, who was doing some work. A fundamental question that he wanted to, I think it was at Bell Labs at that time. Fundamental question that he wanted to ask is, as he was monitoring a process, he wanted to know if a change had occurred in that process, if something good had happened, if something bad had happened, and how would he know? And the reason that question was so hard to answer is because he knew whenever you're monitoring a process, and especially whenever you're taking measurements off that process, in flow, we talk about cycle time and throughput or whatever. Whenever you're taking any type of measurement off that process, off a process, those measurements will always contain some type of variation from one data point to the next. There will always be some type of variation. So it's not as easy as saying, hey, my last point was 3 and my next point is 5, so that means there's been a change. You can't say that because some amount of variation is to be expected. The question that he needed to answer then was, well, if variation is to be expected, how much variation is too much? And this might be some place where Prateek can jump in, but the typical approach at the time, and I'm sad to say it's still the same approach now, that a lot of people take, is to fit your data to a well-known probability distribution. I know, Prateek, I don't know if you want to say, this might be a great
Yeah,
opportunity for you to jump in and
it's
say a few things about that. Why?
say 5 words and then shut up for the rest of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's, it, this is again we'll go back to the flaw of averages, right? It's Dr. Sam Savage's work on this. That was a common practice, and in lieu of machines that could do this stuff for us, in lieu of having better ways to calculate these things, that was a decent enough approximation. Now, it was an approximation, and turns out, as we will get into, it was actually a pretty bad approximation. When you didn't know the exact things, it was actually a pretty bad approximation. A normal curve is only normal in its name. It does not exist in most measurements we take. And that's why that curve fitting, those calculating of things based on predetermined probability curves, um, turned out to be pretty faulty. And as Dr. Sam Savage calls it, there was steam error statistics that we can easily move past. And the starting of that moving past is what Dan is talking about.
Yeah, so Shewhart recognized this exact problem. He recognized that those theoretical probability distributions were just that. They were theoretical. They were theoretical limits of infinite series is, right? And what Dr.
Mhm.
Shewhart realized is that by definition, his data set was finite. And there's no way that he could prove using a finite data set that his finite data fit any particular probability model. In addition to that, what he quickly understood was, it's quite possible that you could have several different, for lack of a better word, this is the word that Dr. Shewhart used. You could be sampling from several different universes, right? A probability model assumes that you are sampling from a single known universe. And what Dr. Shewhart realized was, I'm taking this data, I'm measuring this data. I don't know if I'm measuring radius of oranges or heights of giraffes or shoe sizes of American 13-year-olds, right? I do not know the universe that I'm sampling from. So therefore, it's really impossible for me to sit here and say, okay, this data fits this probability distribution and this data set fits this probability distribution. So the approach that he wanted to come up with was, how do I understand the variation of my process independent of any knowledge of any underlying distribution? I don't know, do you want to jump in here, or do you want me to keep going?
No, and then this is, I mean, this becomes a classic problem because if it's like rolling dice. You essentially, another way to look at this is, you don't know. You might assume you're rolling six-sided dice, but you have no idea the measurements you're taking. Are they coming from a six-sided dice, from a three-sided die, from a 20-sided die? You have no idea, and that is the problem that Schwartz trying to solve, which is, in absence of knowing whether these numbers are coming from a six-sided die or a 20-sided die, how do I figure out, or coming from both, how do I figure out, oh, how much variation is too much variation?
Right. Exactly. And so without getting too heavy into the mathematics just yet, we might do a video on the mathematics later. We might not. I'm not necessarily sure. Again, the invitation is there to leave us a comment if you want to see that. But the genius of the Shewhart approach was he was able to come up with what he called control limits, where he was able to take some data, do some calculations on it, draw these or sorry, calculate these limits to be able to understand, hey, is all the data within these limits, and or is there some data outside the limits? And his the the point of his solution was he was assuming, I shouldn't say assuming, he actually proved this, he empirically proved it, that the purpose of these limits was to characterize something greater than 99% of the variation in the process. He's like, if you have a data point that falls within these limits, there's a really, really good chance, there's a better than great chance that data point is normal, routine. It's part of the normal operation of your process. So if you have a point outside, outside those limits, there's a really, really good chance that that's exceptional variation, and that means that, hey, something weird, something's different is happening. Now, the way he chose to show this stuff is he would plot the data as a run chart, a time series run chart, and there's specific definitions around really what a run chart, what a time series is, what a run chart is. I think we talked about time series and run charts in previous videos.
Definitely talked about time series. Yeah.
Anyway, he plotted the data as a run chart, and then on that run chart, he was able to draw those lines that represented those limits, that represented kind of the boundaries of the normal variation of your process. And he called that resulting chart a control chart, right? So I'm going to come back and say a couple of things. I'm going to let Prateek here in a second, but I want to be clear. The thing that he called a control chart was independent of any underlying distribution, did not require independent, identically distributed data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these things, all these assumptions around control charts that you maybe have heard, that your data has to be normally distributed, blah, blah, blah. He wasn't assuming any of that. All of the mathematics that he did were independent of kind of classic assumptions of probability distributions. So, like I said, there's some more I want to say about that, but I don't know if you want to jump in and say anything.
It's essentially just, I'm going to try to summarize all that with as little maths as possible. We're not assuming anything. We are measuring and plotting our measurements, and based on the values of those measurements, figuring out where those control lines are, where that control band is between those lines, and then going, did a point in our measurements, or does a future point even fall inside or outside those lines? That's what we're doing. We're not assuming any other math. We're not assuming distribution. We're not assuming anything. We're just saying we're measuring the stuff and then drawing those lines.
So for me, I mean, like I said, the math geek in me kind of wants to talk a little bit about the mathematics, because the way that he flipped the whole probability distribution thing on its head, for me, is just pure genius. It's just pure genius. So, the reason I mentioned that is because everything that we said up until now, I think, is genius. The Shewhart approach is genius. The one thing that I would love to go back to and talk to Dr. Shewhart about and say, hey, Walt, buddy, what were you thinking? Is, unfortunately, those lines that he drew, he called those three sigma limits. Now, in Walter's world, in Dr. Shewart's world, sigma, and actually in statistics in general, sigma is a measure of dispersion, right? That's the generic term sigma is meant to mean, again, generically, a measure of dispersion. Unfortunately, most people learn sigma as sigma always means the Greek letter sigma anyway. And by the way, I don't have to go check this. I believe Shewhart spelled out sigma. I'm not sure they use the Greek letter. I have to go look at the text. Don't quote me on that. Do not quote me on that, anybody, before we get hate mail or whatever. But most people believe that the Greek letter sigma means standard deviation. And Shewhart went to great pains to explain that the sigma that he was talking about was just that generic measure of dispersion. It did not mean standard deviation. Now, it turns out it turns out that if you have a predictable process, as Shewhart would characterize it, that the sigma, the standard deviation, is a pretty decent approximation of his limits. But that's kind of almost coincidental, right? That's not what he was going for. So, okay, so I'll pause here because there's some other things I want to say, and then we can probably wrap this up because this video is already way too long. But so that's the first thing you need to understand is when Walter Shewhart was talking about, when he talked about sigma, he definitely did not mean standard deviation. I don't know, Prateek, help me explain that a
No,
little.
and over the years, those two have been conflated, and they have been taught that way even. You know, the three sigma limit has been taught as three standard deviations from the mean on both sides. Um, as Dan's saying, unfortunately, that is wrong because it when you're doing that and when you're saying that that encompasses 98%, 99% of our stuff, you are assuming that normal distribution to say things like that. Sigma as dispersion usually will cover the same area, but it's not the same as sigma as standard deviation.
Yep. So the limits, so most properly, the limits that Shewhart was drawing on his charts. What he would do is he would draw a center line on the chart, which was the mean, of the population, arithmetic mean of the population, and then he'd take the mean plus 3 sigma, his 3 sigma, the mean plus 3 sigma, the mean minus 3 sigma, to get those limits. So if you've heard of the term Six Sigma, it's my understanding that's where it was supposed to have come from. Now, as Prateek said, over the years, people have with even I think even within the Six Sigma movement, have come to interpret Six Sigma as meaning plus 3 standard deviations and minus 3 standard deviations, which was never Shewhart's intent. And once you start saying plus 3 standard deviations and minus 3 standard deviations, exactly as Prateek just said, people start assuming, oh, well, that means that your data has to be normally distributed. If we want to guarantee that it's 99 point whatever percent within those limits, that means that your data has to be normally distributed. And so all of these misnomers, all of these fallacies, all of these mistakes started creeping into the term control chart, right? So fast forward to the 1990s, the late 1990s, and Dr. Wheeler, who's a direct descendant, if you will, of Walter Shewhart, got together with a few people in the industry and frustrated at the time because, as Prateek said, all of these terms had been conflated and misconstrued and misunderstood or whatever. Decided if we want to be clear that we're talking about Shewhart's original intent, the chart that Shewhart drew, we're going to call that a process behavior chart, or a PBC. Control chart, we don't know what that is because that's, and maybe I think in the next video, we're going to talk about some problems with the name control chart. Control charts, we don't know what that is. If we're talking about the Shewhart way of thinking, that is going to now be called a process behavior chart.
And all the things that Dan said, all the history he just gave you, all the math that he just gave you, you're probably sitting there going, why does this matter to me? Why should it matter to me? We're definitely going to hit on that in the next video as we go deeper into process behavior charts. Just to bring that the full circle, Dan, why does this history matter to people where they're looking at things like throughput or cycle time or any modern day measurements? Why does this matter?
And this, as you said, I think this is something that we definitely are. We're probably going to spend the most of the next video talking about. I would say it matters on at least, for me, it matters on at least 2 levels. I imagine you can maybe add a couple in here. First and foremost, for me, it matters because if you're going off and reading about this stuff, just having an understanding of the nomenclature, I think is hugely important, because now when you read and you see the word control chart in anything that you're reading, and it wasn't written by Shewhart, and it wasn't written by Deming, and it wasn't written by Wheeler, you cannot make any assumption about what that person means when they say the word control chart. You just cannot. And most likely you probably have no idea what that, unless that author has explicitly called it out. That for me, that's number one. Number two, which I think is a much more important thing for most of us, although I really do hope you're reading about these things. But practically speaking, the second reason is there are many tools out there that will provide you something called a control chart. And again, unless you know specifically how that chart was created, it most certainly probably is not a control chart. And even if you do know how it is created, you could probably prove then that, hey,
That
the
it
way
is.
that the way that they drew this thing is not a control chart. So for me, those are the two big things. I don't know. Was there
Yeah,
anything you would add?
and the one thing I'll add to it is if someone tells you, oh, this is old stuff and doesn't apply to our stuff because this assumes that your data should be normally distributed and all that stuff, you now know that that is not a valid thing. That is not a valid reason to not use these tools. As Dan said early on, this is simply measuring and then using those measurements to figure out the stuff. This is not assuming anything else about your data. So you cannot, you should not just reject this because some faulty assumptions that people have made about
Yeah. So if anybody wants to learn more about this, I I do, believe it or not, I do highly recommend that you go and read the original Shewhart. Um, it's not the easiest read in the world. I think this is why most people probably gravitate toward Deming,
it.
because Deming is a lot more accessible. Even though I gotta be honest, I'm not a fan of Deming's writing style, but certainly his text is much more accessible than Shewhart's. But if you are interested in this stuff, you have to go read the original Shewhart. If you're not up to reading the original Shewhart, then honestly, the only authority that I trust on this subject is Dr. Donald Wheeler. And I think we've talked about Dr. Wheeler several times on this podcast. Prateek and I have had several conversations in the past with Dr. Wheeler trying to understand this stuff. He is our greatest living resource in terms of under. So go to his website, spcpress.com. So um,
And if you we're gonna get into cross-behavior charts in the next episode, but if you want to get even more of this, even more of Dan's take on this stuff, Dan has a new book out, which you should check out, with which goes a lot deeper into applying all these same things into our world.
So I think that's it for now. Like I said, we probably shoved way too much stuff in this video. We'll get to a little bit. We'll dive a little bit deeper onto some of these miss whatever miss insert your whatever here in the next video. So anything else to add, or should we just wrap it up?
No, that's it. This just Spartacus actually moves, so he's
Yeah.
moved. Nisha does.
So we can't promise that Nisha will be in the next video, but I'm sure she is here in spirit. So for Nisha, for Spartacus, and Prateek Singh, my name is Daniel Bacanti. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for sticking with us through this video, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye, everyone.
Yeah.